Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today we're asking important questions like, is it okay to just root for the bad guys? Does it allow you to completely forget an earlier movie if you add "the" to the title? Yes, we're talking about The Suicide Squad with Paul Hoppe and Jessica Plummer. All that and more after a commercial break we have no control over. Welcome back. I'm Matthew. I'm your host. I'm joined, as I said, by Jessica Plummer and Paul Hoppe. Paul, let's start with you. Why do you think James Gunn hates birds quite so much as he does?
My standing theory is that he was locked in a crate with birds for 3 hours by either his father or his mother, or possibly both.
My theory is that this all has to do with him parking his car somewhere. Like, he just got his first good paycheck, he bought a really nice car, and some birds did what birds do. But, you know, we're going to discuss that important ethical issue. Jessica, let me welcome you with an important other issue. When you have a movie title, and you then add "the," does it become a new movie?
Oh, it's completely different. There's a totally different animal.
There you go. There you go. Well, let's just jump right into it, because we've obviously had a number of pieces of media kind of leading up to this. Some canonical, like the earlier Suicide Squad movie, although it sort of feels like they didn't want that to be canon. The Birds of Prey movie, which is kind of a spin-off of that. Obviously, the comic books about the Suicide Squad. We've had the Harley Quinn cartoon, which is completely non-canonical to any of this, but certainly has shown a very interesting side of Harley, and as I'll argue later, has kind of given us a new perspective on how to tell stories about villains. So with all that, let me kind of start by asking both of you, where were you kind of thinking as you went into this movie? Like, in terms of all that different media that's out there, what were you kind of feeling in terms of expectations or concerns or hopes or things you wanted or didn't want, or just kind of how you felt when you sat down to watch this movie?
Go for it, Paul.
Okay. What is this canon that you speak of? Because I didn't have any sense of that existing within the context of this movie. I actually, first I'll say that I enjoyed the first Suicide Squad more than most other people did. It's got some issues for sure, but it's probably my favorite DC EU movie until this one, at least. Wonder Woman and Birds of Prey, and then Shazam, I guess, being the other ones that are kind of in that same region. There's other ones that I really, really dislike. I really appreciate Harley's arc from the first Suicide Squad. From the first Suicide Squad movie through Birds of Prey into this. One of the reasons that I think some things in the first Squad movie didn't bother me the way I think a lot of people had problems with it was because I expected that there would be a character arc that would end up this direction. I think this is kind of the arc that she has had throughout the comics, throughout her history as a character, and I think it all actually works very well together. This movie doesn't feel to me like it cares about the idea of canonicity or the DCEU. I didn't feel like it was trying to unwrite the first Suicide Squad movie. I felt like it just didn't care about it. Yeah. And speaking of not caring, I've been like really down on media in general recently. Stuff like this movie is the sort of thing that I've mostly been disliking. And I was basically just done with the DCEU after the Snyder Cut. I disliked it more in terms of quantity than I think anything I've seen. And thus I have no emotional investment in that universe anymore. And I almost think for that reason, I enjoyed this movie way more than I would have otherwise. Basically, the only reason I watched it is because in the preview I saw the Amanda Waller Bloodsport face-off like showdown, and I was like, oh yeah, I'll watch a movie with Idris Elba and Viola Davis like going head to head. Like, yeah. Sure, yeah, we'll do that. And then in the first scene, they're like, we're gonna kill a bird, and I'm like, I'm gonna hate this movie. And then somehow I didn't. I don't know.
No, that's certainly fair, and I did not like Suicide Squad the way you did. I did quite like the Amanda Waller presentation, and I think the point you make about Harley's arc is interesting in both like sort of an in-character and a meta way in terms of both the arc the character has had, but also the arc of how the character is shot in terms of like being a sex object or having more agency or stuff like that. So we'll definitely talk about that. I also agree with you on the canon thing of, and I kind of did this intentionally in the intro, at this point it feels to me like Suicide Squad, Birds of Prey, and this movie form a canon that is like very loosely connected to the rest of the DC canon, but is basically its own little the Harley universe, basically, for all intents and purposes. Jessica, what about yourself? Where were you kind of falling when you sat down to watch this movie?
So I didn't actually see the first Suicide Squad movie because everything I heard made it sound like something I would very much not enjoy. I did see Birds of Prey. I would say it's probably my favorite of the DC movies, with Wonder Woman as a close second. I absolutely adored Birds of Prey. And I don't even necessarily I think all three of presumably Suicide Squad, the first one, can be watched on its own because it was the first one. I think you can watch either this movie or Birds of Prey completely separately. You can put them together, but I don't think you have to at all.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
And I do think that there is, I don't necessarily see Harley in this as a continuation of what we saw in Birds of Prey, but I know we're going to talk about Harley plenty, so we can talk about that later. I also I've read the original run of the Suicide Squad comics from starting in the late 80s by John Ostrander and Kim Yale, and a bunch of artists. Luke McDonnell was the first one on the book, I think. And I really loved that comic. It's rightfully considered an amazing piece of work and a really groundbreaking comic. I haven't read so much of dabbled in the subsequent Suicide Squad comics. I haven't read really any of them for the past decade or so since the New 52 happened, although I am reading the current volume. But I also would say that this movie, in a lot of ways, owes more to the book Secret Six by Gail Simone and, again, a number of different artists from the late 2000s, which is also about a team of supervillains who we're meant to root for, except they don't really have that government affiliation. They're just kind of doing their own thing. But I think that the tone of that fits what we saw in this movie a bit better than at least those original Suicide Squad comics, which are very they spend a lot of time on moral complexities and the psychology of the characters, and this movie was not interested in any of those things.
Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to ask, is that the series with is Catman one of those secret? Yeah, okay, I've read some.
Yeah, that's the one with Scandal Savage and Bane and Catman and Deadshot, who Deadshot is a classic Suicide Squad character.
Right.
I know he was played by Will Smith in the first movie, and I believe they were going to have Idris Elba just play that character because Will Smith didn't want to come back. But then they were like, oh, maybe we could keep using him, so we'll give him a different DC character to be playing.
Give him a different character that's the same, and then have another character who has the same backstory as well, and just be like, yeah whatever.
Yeah, I'd say they basically just gave him a different name instead of a different character, because it's a very, very similar character concept.
Yeah, I mean, Bloodsport, there are a few Bloodsports in the comics, that character does actually exist. They didn't make him up out of whole cloth, but I don't think anybody's like, oh yeah, you left out the intricacies of his personality from his 3 issues of Action Comics in 1992 or whenever he showed up.
Right.
Which in some ways is good, because kind of gives Idris Elba that blank slate, because I did think he was one of the best things in the movie. And so let me actually start with a question for you, Jess, because I think one of the biggest ethical questions we want to get into is this idea of, what happens when you tell a story where the protagonists aren't heroes, and in fact where the protagonists are pretty terrible people, but terrible people who are charming and interesting and charismatic, and it can be fun to watch or even maybe root for them. And I think I want to jump into how this movie approached it, because I think I think they had a very interesting take that I think is very inspired by the Harley Quinn cartoon that we'll debate if it's good or not, kind of ethically and kind of what it's trying to do. But let me to give us the context, tell us more about how did the Suicide Squad comic books and the Secret Six a little bit, but especially the originals, how did they deal with this story? How did they deal with this question of basically asking the audience to root for terrible people?
Yeah, so with Secret Six, it was pretty consistently, it was two things. One, always make sure that the people they're fighting are worse.
Right.
Um, so, Deadshot may be a murderer, but he's not a child murderer. So he can go kill a child murderer, and we're like, oh, okay, good for him.
Right.
Um, so that's pretty consistent, and also there's a really it becomes a running gag in the series that they're mercenaries. They'll take jobs for money, and then it'll turn out that the people who hired them are actually like complicit or really awful, and then they'll be like, okay, we can't actually take this money, we're in fact going to kill the person who hired us. And then they're like, we don't have any money. Like it's a running thing, and it's charming. I don't really I can't buy I don't think anybody in this movie except maybe Rick Flag deciding that. And like maybe Nanue because he doesn't understand money. But
Yeah.
the thing that Suicide Squad would usually do, at least again, I'm really mostly familiar with the first run of it from the 80s, but it was always a grab bag of like you had a spectrum of people, right? So you had supervillains who were absolutely terrible people, no remorse, they don't care about anyone. So like Joker showed up occasionally. Captain Boomerang was a mainstay, and he had absolutely no moral compass whatsoever. And then you had characters who were villains. They were not anti-heroes. They were bad, but they had lines. And like Deadshot typically fell into that category. And then you would have more sort of anti-hero characters, which Harley wasn't in that iteration because she didn't exist then. But I would say Harley fits there pretty well.
Right.
And then you had tortured heroes who got into bed with the government for whatever reason because they felt like they had to, or they had screwed up in some way and this was some sort of emotional penance for them. And I can't think of a good, because that's sort of what Peacemaker is here, except he's not really, but like the comics would use like Nightshade for that, or Bronze Tiger. But you would have, whenever a moral decision came up, you would have a difference of opinions on how to handle it. Like you would have the people who didn't care if it was bad, and you had the people who were like, we can't do this, and then you had the people in the middle who would say, I don't like it, but we have to because either they'll blow up our heads, or if we don't, something worse will happen. And that's not really a range that we get here.
Right.
It's there's those discussions don't happen.
One of the senses that I got from both the first and the second Suicide Squad movie, and I want to go more into kind of the way they frame it in this one, but just kind of a general thing, is that most of the characters are more amoral than immoral. And what I mean by that is that most of them aren't like, mwahaha, I have all this malice in my heart, I want to do all of these horrible, terrible things to people. It's more either that they think they're the good guy, or that they're just sort of like, well, I'm just, making my way in the world, trying to make a buck, and I don't want to kill people, but that's how I get paid, or that's how I Harley doesn't set out to do harm to people. She just doesn't really care if she does harm to people, if they're getting in the way of her freedom or her breakfast sandwich or whatever the heck it is.
Yeah,
do
I would
you
say
think
the
that's a fair
only
characterization of the comics as well? That kind of more amoral instead of immoral?
I think again, it's definitely a range. I would agree. Like for this movie, the only character I can think of who I would say is actually sadistic is the Thinker, and
Yeah.
he's
Yeah.
not on the squad.
Yeah.
But yeah, again, it's a range. I think the vast majority of them are amoral, or the morality that they have does not apply to what they're doing.
Right.
But again, you will occasionally get a character like the Joker, who, I mean, he's only very briefly in that original run, or a couple of others that I'm sure they are there. I just can't think of who they are at the moment, who are truly gleefully evil. But I think also like Waller is very practical, and that kind of mindset is not going to suit her well for, like, she wants people who don't care and also who are self-interested because their
Right.
motivation is not to get their heads blown up.
Yeah.
Right. And Waller's a character we're definitely going to talk about quite a lot once we get to that.
I'll add that I feel like Ratcatcher 2 is more of an anti-hero than
I think
any
it's fair.
you know, like I'm like, what? She robbed a bank, maybe? Like, whatever. I mean, I don't know. I don't really feel that strongly about people robbing banks. Like, maybe she had rats eat people. Like, in terms of like criticisms of Ratcatcher 2's moral compass or whatever, I would say like, you know, using rats for personal gain is like the thing that I object to most. Whereas like besides that, it's like, I don't know, she seems pretty decent. Like,
Right.
you know.
See, that's the thing for me where I I agree with you and I don't agree with you, and I think it's a failure of the movie's writing as
Yeah.
opposed to a failure of the movie's moral framework, because she's definitely like by far the nicest and kindest person in the whole movie. And I mean, I adored her. I thought she was adorable. I love Sebastian. He's a very
Yeah.
good little rat. Um, and I agree with you. Like, okay, she robbed a bank. She failed to rob a bank. Like,
Right,
I
right,
don't
right.
care at all about
Yeah.
that. But she does, I mean, we don't see it graphically, but the implication is that she does murder people pretty casually and carelessly throughout this movie whenever they're in a
Right.
fight scene, or at
Yeah.
least mutilate them. And she's not bothered by the fact that everybody else is murdering people all the time, constantly, until it's Rick Flag.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that, I don't think that, to me, that doesn't feel like an intentional disconnect. To me, that feels like one of those things we're not supposed to think about too hard, because I can't make sense of a character who is so kind to this shark man and says things like, if I die because I gambled on love, it will have been worth it, and then just doesn't care when hundreds of innocent people are slaughtered.
Right.
Right.
Well, so let's use that actually as kind of a jumping off point, because I think the way the movie frames morality, or as I see it at least, frames like a reason to not care about morality, is I think one of the ethically the most interesting things that it does. And we can talk about whether it's a good or bad thing. And let me start by kind of explaining what I see as the frame, and tell me if you guys agree with this. Tell me if you folks agree with this. And Jessica, you have not seen the Harley Quinn cartoon, or have you not seen much of it, correct?
Just clips here and there.
Okay. So one of the things that cartoon does that I think this show also did, that this movie also did, is instead of like the original Suicide Squad movie did try very hard to make these people into misunderstood heroes with a heart, bad people with a heart of gold. And everyone had a tragic backstory, and Harley discovered the magical power of friendship, and like it was a very much kind of like, and I think it's probably why a lot of people didn't like the movie. It felt very saccharine for what the Suicide Squad was supposed to be, with none of the kind of ethical conundrums you're talking about. The Harley Quinn cartoon, it seemed to basically be telling the audience, look, things don't matter in this universe, because what would happen is Harley would very rarely like actually seek out to kill innocent people. In the first scene, her and Joker like brutally murder, evil corporate executives, and Poison Ivy is seen like murdering, corporate executives again, but who for environmental reasons. It's a very anti-corporate show, love it. But there's a lot of times where like she accidentally kills innocent people. She like misunderstands and like 5 people die tragically, or like she like there's a lot of kind of like oops moments where a lot of innocent people died, but she says oops, and Poison Ivy kind of rolls her eyes and the audience laughs. And I felt like it worked in some ways, because it was kind of a way of saying like, look, this is not, we're trying to let you enjoy a story about terrible people, so we're trying to tell you like this doesn't really count. And to me, it felt like this was very, very similarly trying to do the same thing. And the thing to me that really like underlined that was when our heroes our protagonists, have this long drawn out scene of killing all of these people they think are guarding Rick Flag, and killing them in like horrifically brutal ways, where they're, in the case of Bloodsport and Peacemaker, literally competing to see who can do so in the most gruesome ways.
It was a very Legolas Gimli kind of moment.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a perfect description of it. And then they find out that actually they just slaughtered like freedom fighters, like the literal good guys in this movie. And none of them actually says the word oops, but it had that exact same kind of energy of like, well, oops, we weren't supposed to do that. Oh, well, life goes on.
Not for them, but
Yeah, exactly. And to me, that was kind of the movie saying, like, don't take this seriously. Paul, you and I a long time ago talked about the movie Desperado, where there it's more clear that, like, it's a hero against villains. But if you think about it, most of the villains are just, like, poor people getting paid by the crime boss because they have no job, and they're all slaughtered in, like, horrifically gruesome but hilarious ways. And the movie kind of sets it up as like, yeah, it's okay to laugh at this.
No, well, I mean, it very deliberately, like, there's a whole, like, everybody I've killed is somebody's brother, somebody's father, somebody's son. Like,
it's not a perfect example. It does that for like 75% of the movie and then shifts. But folks, the Harley Quinn's probably the better example of that. So to me, that's and we'll talk in a minute about, like, is that a good framework and does that work to kind of make you feel okay with things? But just to start, does that framework does that make sense to you all in terms of how this movie was approaching it? And Paul, I'll start with you because you have seen Harley Quinn.
Yeah, sort of. It definitely had a similar vibe to the Harley Quinn show, I would say, in terms of things like, in quotes, like, not mattering, basically, both in terms of, any sort of canonicity with anything else. Like, the Harley Quinn show, I didn't really like the first or second episode, but once I came around to the point of, like, all right, this is just a totally different, set of stories set with characters that have the same names and are like the characters in a bunch of other stories, but are completely different representations of those characters. I started to enjoy it a lot more. It definitely has a lot of that, like, whoopsie, didn't mean to kill that entire picnic, filled with people. Like, I thought, that they were somebody else. Like, and that definitely, the scene where they kill all the freedom fighters, which became painfully obvious to me that that's what was going on. I was like, these are not, I don't no. And then they were sort of like, they weren't going to actually talk about it, right? But they're like, so, right. Yeah, that happened. I mean, I don't know, like, how I feel about it, but, like, within the context of this movie, I do feel like it successfully kind of got me to a place pretty quickly where, like, I didn't care so much about that sort of thing as I would in some other pieces of media. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I have some thoughts on, like, manipulation in media and, like, character deaths, and I don't know, maybe that's something we're getting into later, but, like, I feel like I'm trying to be manipulated by a lot of things, and those things really stick out at me and bother me. In this movie, I don't know, maybe, like, I didn't feel that. And maybe that's the mark of good manipulation, right? Like, somehow successfully, the movie got to a place where I was just like, all right, you killed a bunch of birds, and, like, I would probably hate this movie, but for some reason, I don't really. And I don't know, maybe just you put Idris Elba in a thing, and I'm probably going to like it. But I like all the Thor movies. I don't know, what can I say? I kind of went off topic there.
It's okay.
Idris Elba's never off topic.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I think that you're, like, Matthew, I think that's a very accurate description of the framework that the movie is using. Mm-hmm. The problem for me, I mean, there's a couple of problems because it does that a few times. Like, the whole opening sequence where they're like, here, this is your team. Haha, just kidding, they're all dead.
Right.
I think it's actually really effective, and I did not expect, like, I knew a lot of them were going to die. I didn't actually expect that complete bait and switch. Like, I really thought Captain Boomerang was going to make it because he is such a mainstay of the Suicide Squad. But I also, I have this running joke with Becky, who's been on the show a bunch of times, about how Jai Courtney, who plays Captain Boomerang, is a franchise killer because every time he's in, like, a major a big franchise like Die Hard, or I think he was in one of the Terminator movies, he was in Divergent and the first Suicide Squad, and they always bomb and it's terrible and he's trying so hard. So maybe they were just, killing him early to save themselves. Mm-hmm. But I do think that in that instance, it worked. But for me, like, the freedom fighters scene is the best example of it. And yeah, it's really clear. I mean, it's clear the minute you see them. Like this is not the army. These
Yeah, there are
are
people like doing
guerrilla fighters.
errands. Like,
Yeah, they're wearing like tank tops and cargo pants. Like they're not. It's so clear. The visual shorthand is so clear. So the whole time you're watching them be slaughtered, you know the joke that's being set up. Like it's very clear how that sequence has to end. And to me, it made me profoundly uncomfortable because it is this wholesale slaughter of innocent black and brown people. Mm-hmm. Like, that's the thing. This is not a case of like mowing down evil corporate executives or even a bunch of supervillains who we are informed right at the beginning are terrible people. These are innocent people at worst, probably actively good people, and they are marginalized people whose country has been through terrible things. And then even that wouldn't bother me so much if I feel like the movie tries to have it both ways, because the sort of moral event horizon, the thing that they cannot get past, the thing that Rick can't get past and dies for it, and the thing to a certain extent that Ratcatcher and Bloodsport can't get past is that the US was involved, that all of this happened, this terrible monster was created, and these people were experimented on and abused and murdered because of US involvement. And we're supposed to, they don't spend a lot of time on it, but we're supposed to go, oh yeah, no, that's very terrible, and that is a good reason that you would draw a line in the sand. And yet we're also supposed to laugh at a team sent by the American government showing up and slaughtering people.
Right.
Like, though I feel like those don't both work in the same movie. And to me, another instance of that is Waller's backup team. Because in the beginning of the movie, like, the way we're introduced to them is they're betting on who's going to survive the mission. And throughout that whole opening sequence, they do not, throughout most of the movie, they do not care about the team. They, like, there's a moment where I think it's Boomer dies, and one of the guys gives his picture on his computer screen the finger. Like, they don't care about these people. They don't care that they have sent them to their deaths, that they have knowingly sent them to be killed as a distraction without telling them. It does not matter to them, and they're even having a little bit of fun with it. But then later, we're supposed to believe that they would say, no, Waller, you've gone too far. You can't kill these people.
So I have a slightly different reading of that situation at the end. I agree that it felt weird that they would turn on Waller like that, mostly because I feel like it undermines her, like, credibility and menace as just this imposing figure. But I don't feel like they turned on her because they wanted to save the Suicide Squad. I think they turned on her because they wanted the squad to save, the villagers, basically, from Starro.
Right.
So I feel like that was their line. I kind of don't buy this, like, group of Apple Store employees, like, turning on Amanda Waller. I'm like, really? You all became, all of a sudden, like, I don't know. And then the fact that two of them are clearly still alive at the end of the movie.
Yeah.
Although the woman who hit her over the head is conspicuously absent then. But
to me,
good.
To me, it reminded me very much of the scene in Captain America: The Winter Soldier, where that one guy is supposed to, like, launch the helicarrier or whatever it is he's supposed to be doing. I don't remember the MacGuffins of that movie.
Yeah.
But, and he refuses to do it.
MacGuffin.
Right. He refuses to do it, and he says, captain's orders, and it's, like, the most powerful scene in the movie. Everybody loves that scene. It's a great scene. But it works because we didn't sit with him for an hour and a half watching him be a total douchebag.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And I feel like we're supposed to have a similar reaction, or at least something of a similar reaction. And I'm like, I don't know about that, James Gunn. Don't know.
I that was probably my biggest problem with the movie, honestly. I figured when we wrote the outline, we're going to bounce around a bit. So let's just kind of get into the Amanda Waller of it all. To me, the opening scenes were perfect. because with Amanda Waller is my favorite character in the DC universe. I've said that a couple times, and I do think Viola Davis is fantastic as her. I think CCH Pounder as the voice in the animated show is still going to always be my holy grail, and the decision to make her thin and pretty and young in the Archerverse is not my favorite, but the Arrowverse. Sorry, Archerverse is somewhat different. I got the shows confused a lot when they first came out. Very different mindsets. But the point being, to me, I thought those opening scenes were a perfect illustration of her character, because you have, like, one thing that people can do often when they're kind of asked to do terrible things, you know, the easiest way to get the human mind to justify awful things is to dehumanize the people you're doing them to. Mm-hmm. You know, every army, especially the American army, is, you know, but armies throughout history have often been told, like, the people you're killing are not really human. They're not like you. They're subhuman. And to me, all of them kind of like taking bets and cheering, like I said, putting a finger up at the screen. I thought it was Weasel, but it might have been Boomerang. Like, that shows how those people are just like, they're morally devoid. You know, they're in the, like, they're in that place of, like, I have divested myself from seeing the humanity in these people, and that's awful and terrible. Amanda Waller, though, is very different, because what I felt like was Amanda Waller still sees these people as human. She doesn't love the idea that she's killing people, but she knows that they are tools. Like, in her mind, the protection of the United States and the protection of the world, because in her mind those are the same thing, and the protection of the U.S. security is the protection of the U.S. and thus the world, that for her it's a numbers game of, like, you know, the world will end if I don't protect this, and so if we have to sacrifice people, you know, she's that kind. Like, to me it was wonderful, because I thought there was a great debate there of, like, which one is more evil? The person who convinces themselves that other people aren't human or aren't sentient life worthy of you know, respect and value, or the person who fully knows that they are, and then will happily still send them to their death, or not happily, but still send them to their death in light of what they see as, like, the greater good. And I feel like that was such a fascinating discussion, and I wanted to get into that, and then the scene at the end just so undercuts it. And what was doubly annoying to me, especially because, like, this is a, you know, black woman character who is supposed to have so much power and respect and authority. And like you said, Paul, I think that undercut it. So I'm curious, did you all get that same dynamic that I was talking about in the beginning scenes of, like, how she and them were seeing this all totally differently?
I mean, I think you're giving a lot. Like, I agree with you. The performance in the movie is fantastic, but I do think that you're giving what's actually on the screen a lot of credit based on what you know about Amanda Waller. Like, I don't see any conflict or remorse in her in what is actually in this movie. I didn't see a divide between how she felt about these people and how her staff felt about these people. Mm-hmm. It was just that she has no time for bullshit. I will say I did not particularly like this take on Waller. I don't think that she's out of character necessarily, because the character's been around for like 35 years now, and there's a range of behavior for her. Right. I tend to prefer a version of Waller who is more complicated and less pretty far over in the evil category. Like the point where she's like, I'm going to blow up the whole Suicide Squad because they're going to try and stop this evil starfish from taking over the world seemed... I mean, it also, like, aside from her getting knocked out, undercutting her, that thing is going to take over other countries, too. Like, it's just a stupid decision not to let the squad try and take it down.
Yeah, no, everything I'm saying about her depiction, I thought was completely undercut by that end scene. I thought her actions there made absolutely no sense. I would totally agree with you there.
But I also, like, I just very recently read one of the later arcs, or reread one of the later arcs of that original Suicide Squad, and it's also set in Corto Maltese, because basically there has been another political coup, but the guy who is now in charge has brought a bunch of random American supervillains with him, and he's like, this is the Suicide Squad, the US government is behind me. And Waller at this point is no longer affiliated with the government, and she does not run a real Suicide Squad, but they just kind of follow her around anyway. And she's super pissed because she's like, no, the things that are being done in my name and in the name of what I created are wrong. They are a step too far. They are evil, and I'm going to stop it, and I'm going to liberate this country, even though there's nothing in it for her, and she is not necessarily protecting US interests in any way. She just thinks that it is wrong.
Yeah.
And she goes in herself, like she's in like camo in the jungle fighting people herself.
That's
with her
awesome.
team.
I want
And
to
it's
read
awesome,
this.
it's great. But it also shows a character who still has a heart, even though it is a very bitter and fiercely protected one. And I prefer those takes on Waller, although they are increasingly infrequent.
Yeah.
So for me, this version of her, I was like, this is so far.
I would agree with that. Paul, I know you're trying to jump in. I just want to add one quick comment there. And I think you may be right that I'm reading too much in that I think I want to believe the Waller of the first half of this movie. Because I do think, in the cartoon at least, in Justice League, the Justice League animated show, you do get the sense that, like, on some fundamental level, she feels like she's protecting America and the world from bad things happening. And to me, and maybe I have to headcanon this, I like the idea that she's doing this because she does think that this Starro thing is a fundamental threat. And the idea, once it becomes she's just protecting America's, like, and maybe I need to give it less credit because I want it to be that she wants to protect America's secrets, but she also thinks Starro is a bad thing if they can't control it and wants it to be ended. And you're right that by the end, once it becomes, no, she just cares about the secrets. It's not actually about, like, being willing to cut any corner to prevent a global cataclysm. Yeah, that does feel a lot further from the characters I think she should be.
So I don't feel like Matthew's giving too much credit to this version, as the beginning sort of portrayed the character, at least. I think, honestly, the first hour of the movie, I was like, this is one of the most Wallers I feel like I've seen. And I've seen a lot of different Wallers, and, Jessica, you're 100% right, of course, like, there isn't, like, a characterization of any character, right, in comics. Like, there's always, when a character exists for long enough, there's going to be a bunch of different versions. So I guess a better way of saying what I was trying to say is, like, this Waller is felt in the beginning very close to the Waller that I know and love, whereas there's other Wallers I've seen that I'm like, and the one thing that I do feel was a little absent was that feeling of, like, why does she think what she's doing is so necessary? I do think they made her a little bit more of a proxy for U.S. interests rather than, like, global interests. Like, in the Justice League Unlimited series, the animated series, which is, like, my one true Waller, right? Including the epilogue episode, right, where we kind of get to see how her arc played out after that whole season. I feel that she, not only does she think she's right in terms of wanting to protect the world, like, she is right. She's not necessarily right about, like, how she goes about doing it, but, like, yeah, the Justice League is potentially a threat to people, and having some sort of greater balance of power makes a lot of sense. It probably shouldn't be in the hands of the U.S. military, but, like, having some sort of failsafe, what if the Justice League does go rogue? And, you don't have access to Batman's plans to kill them all.
To me, Amanda Waller only makes sense in a world where red kryptonite exists.
Right.
Like, it is possible that Superman wouldn't, which I know, Jessica, I know for you, like, that the whole point of Superman is that he doesn't do that. But
I was more thinking red kryptonite, because in the comics, red kryptonite just has a different weird effect every time. So sometimes it'll give Superman, like, a lion head or make him really tiny. So I was like, I don't I don't understand why that's a problem.
Right.
My canonical knowledge of Red Kryptonite comes from the thing that I think you would agree is the purest, clearest, most canonical Superman that's ever Superman,
I don't like
which
where
is
this
the
is
Richard
going.
Pryor Superman 3.
Oh, I thought you were going to go for Smallville when Clark is exposed to red kryptonite, so he gets a leather jacket and a motorcycle to show how bad he is now.
I will say,
The symbiote takes over him from Spider-Man
Exactly.
3.
Spider Venom, Super Venom.
Yeah.
I think there's even a dance scene.
I will say, I think
Wow.
one other thing that may be playing into this is because I think to some extent you're right. It may be that I'm headcanoning, but it's also that I do think the way Waller is established in the first Suicide Squad movie also helps to really inform my view of her in this, because in that she is very self-serving and she does like kill innocent people in order to facilitate like her own survival, but also the survival of her plans. But I think in that one there's a clearer case of like a horrible thing is happening and the horrible thing has to be stopped. And so I think maybe that's also, Jessica, where you and I are seeing her differently, is that I do think they established that part of her character in the earlier movie. But you're right, it maybe was not, especially given we talked about how this movie is kind of like saying, just care about this one. They should have done more to establish it in this movie specifically.
Yeah, and I think also, Paul, you made a good point. Like, it's not clear why she thinks that what she thinks is necessary and why she thinks it's necessary. Like, it's just sort of set up to get them on the island.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of how much does she know and what does she think will happen, which again is then undermined when she apparently thinks that a giant starfish will not be able to swim.
Well, so here's my counter to that point. The Justice League exists in this world, right? And they've name dropped Superman. I don't know if he's still in the ICU or whatever, but like he's probably fine by now. And I would think that like she knows that this giant starfish isn't going to actually take over the Earth, probably. Like, if the Suicide Squad didn't handle it, like in 20 minutes, the Justice League would be there, because apparently time doesn't matter in terms of getting from place to place in these movies. But like, I would think that that's kind of like her backup plan, is like, whatever, we're just going to clear out and let, the Capes kind of handle things, and like, we've eliminated any trace of U.S. involvement here, although maybe they haven't, and it won't really work out that well. But I don't think Starro is evil. I think that which is clear at the end when it's like, I was just happy floating in space looking at the stars. Like, the Justice League wouldn't have killed Starro. They would have like deported him, basically, or her, right, or it, or whatever. Like, and I do agree, though, that it's like, well, what if they're like, no, we're going to go kill this thing? Like, does she really care that much to stop them?
Yeah.
Like, and if she's going to blow up, like, any of them, like, is she going to blow up all of them or one and be like, okay, now can the rest of us get on with it? Like, and if you do blow them up, then their bodies are going to be there. So if there's any kind of an investigation into it, then it's going to be like, oh, what are they doing here? I mean, I guess you disavow all knowledge because blah, 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 it's Task Force X and it officially doesn't exist. But like, oh, there's all these escaped convicts. Like, I don't know. I just really enjoyed the first half of Amanda Waller. And then towards the end, I was just like, I didn't care that much because I didn't care that much about what was happening in the movie in terms of like consequence, and I didn't care about things going forward. But I was like, you did just totally undercut Amanda Waller. I will say, Matthew, you pointed out, you have this powerful black woman. Like, they didn't have the white chick hit her over the head. Like, they had another black woman hit her over the head, and I think that was very deliberate.
Yes.
In terms of like taking the power away from her or whatever. And like, I guess I appreciate that. Like, if you're gonna do that, like, do that way. But at the same time, they didn't really make her much of a character. Whereas, like, that one dude, like, they made more of a character. And I thought it was, from early on, pretty clear that he was gonna have qualms with some stuff. And
I liked what they were doing with, like, having a white guy or a white woman be the one to hit her would feel really bad. But it was that guy, like you said, the Genius Bar executive, and the blonde woman. I don't even remember. I'm sure that the black woman who hits her was on screen at some point, but I barely remember her. And so, yeah, it felt very forced in that way, which did not, to me, that didn't help.
Right. To me, it made it slightly less bad. But,
it's like they filmed the whole movie and they got to that scene and they were like, shit, we got to get another extra.
Yeah.
Right. But let's give her one line and we'll pay her scale.
All right, well, so we're talking about Waller, and this was kind of part of a larger... I want to kind of go through a couple of characters, but it's part of this larger question of sort of... Because I think it's one question the movie asks quite well, even though, as we said, there's sort of a weird, like, don't care about things, but care about things happening. But even putting that aside, kind of want to ask the question, like, who are the real villains? And, like, just look at this whole topic of villainy by looking at different characters. So let's talk about Peacemaker. What's your take on Peacemaker as both a character, but also sort of like where he falls in terms of who's the real villains of this story?
I mean, my main thought is that it makes me so happy that they accurately depicted his ridiculous Silver Age costume. Like, they went for it in all of its stupidity, and it's beautiful to me. They did that.
Was there a Silver Age moment where he was kind of like their Captain America and he was supposed to be a hero, or was he always just an utter awful person?
So he's not a DC character originally. He was part of the Charlton Comics Action Heroes group, along with Blue Beetle and The Question and Captain Atom are probably the other most famous characters in that group. And this is the Silver Age Blue Beetle, so, not the one who's been in any of the cartoons.
Right.
And those characters, when Charlton went under, were all sold to DC, and they were folded into the DC universe in Crisis on Infinite Earths in the mid-'80s. So right around the time that Amanda Waller and the Suicide Squad first showed up. He's a real... Charlton comics are pretty bad.
Okay.
He's just sort of a generic, like, Vietnam era. He loves peace so much, he'll fight for it, which is idiotic, but it wasn't a deliberate joke when it originally came to be. And those are the characters that, like, Charlton Group are the ones that, when Alan Moore was going to write Watchmen, DC hadn't used those characters yet, but they owned them. So he said, can I use those characters? And DC was like, no, we think we're going to use them for other stuff. And he was like, okay, can I make up thinly veiled versions that are exactly like those characters? And DC was like, yeah, we don't care. And so Peacemaker, I believe, is the comedian in Watchmen, which is an interesting context to put him in.
Is the Question, right?
Yeah. Blue Beetle is Night Owl, etc.
That makes sense. Yeah, the biggest thing I thought while watching Peacemaker is, remind me, Jess, have you seen Falcon and the Winter Soldier?
No, not yet.
Okay. Actually, if you don't mind if I spoil something about a character that's been discussed to death online.
Go for it.
All right. So, and I'll try not to be too spoilery in the show for our audience as well. I don't care about the audience, not you. But my own Amanda Waller version of ethics. In that show, which I highly recommend, there's a character named John Walker, and John Walker feels like Peacemaker feels like the stereotype that we like to laugh about like the idiot who, like, oh my gosh, I like love peace and freedom so much I'll kill any man, woman, and child to get it. And John Walker's the reality of that character. We're like, I want that character to be a walking stereotype. I want them to be a walking joke. But the fact is they have complexity and nuance, and they're totally wrong, but you get where they're coming from, and they can be sympathetic in them being horribly wrong. And to me, I think that was... I don't think I would have enjoyed Peacemaker as a character anywhere near as much if I hadn't gotten to see John Walker recently. But having gotten to see that, it was like... And having to be like, oh, God, I don't want to feel sympathy for this terrible person who thinks that as long as America's ordering him to do it, like, do it. Because he's an awful person, to be very clear, but you feel sympathy for him the way the story's told. And so it was great to just get to hate this character and be like, and laugh at him. If you told me that a character from this movie was going to get to have their own spin-off TV show, I think I would rather watch a TV show about Sebastian the Rat
I mean,
I
who
was
wouldn't? Come on.
thinking
You picked the
Sebastian.
best character.
Okay, bad example.
Yes, I was thinking Sebastian when you started that sentence.
I'd rather watch a TV show about one of the generals. You know, I'd rather watch a TV show about Star. No, Star would be great, but I'd rather watch a TV show about any of them except Peacemaker. And I do think that to me, here's going to be kind of a weird connection, but it fits because of Idris Elba. With none of the same intelligence and depth, to be clear, but in some ways this movie feels kind of like The Wire, the show that Idris Elba was a big star of, in that the main villain isn't any one person. The main villain is the system. You know, the system that has Amanda Waller thinking that anything is justified in order to do what she thinks is right to protect the United States. And the people who work for her who are in the, like, well, I'm just not even going to think about the humanity of the people we're ordering to kill. And then Peacemaker, to me, is like one more part of that system. He's the I'm just following orders type. You know, I believe in the ideal, and if you tell me this serves the ideal, I will do it, no questions asked. And so I feel like I don't think he's a worse villain. I don't think he's more evil than any of the others, but I feel like he Waller, and the people who work for Waller, to me, are all kind of part of a same system that is just evil throughout, with them each having some individuality, of course.
So first of all, I mean, I dig all that I totally agree in terms of like spin-off show. I'm like, what? Like, really? You're doing a piece? I hadn't heard that ahead of time. And when I saw the post-credit scene, I was like, why? Like,
Yeah, I'll also, real quick, like, John Cena, bless his heart, he tried really hard, but it's really clear that one person in this movie is not a professional actor.
Yeah, there's just only so much acting that can go around in professional wrestlers, and Dwayne Johnson got all of it. And it's not very much, to be clear, but whatever there was, Dwayne Johnson got it, and John Cena did not.
Yeah.
I thought he was fine. I don't know.
He was fine.
But I enjoyed that character as a contrast to Bloodsport and their back and forth. Right. And, you know, Bloodsport being able to be like, it sounds like you'll just use liberty as an excuse for anything. And like, yeah, right? And I also think Rick Flag is kind of the John Walker character here.
Yeah, I think it's very fair.
Where he's someone who signed up for the military. He was, you know, sold a false bill of goods. He went around doing a lot of shit that he probably should have realized wasn't good shit to do. And then eventually he got to some point where he was like, wait a minute, like, no, this isn't why I decided to start doing this. And so he did have, you know, a turning point, which, you know, you can think what you can think about it. But also Rick Flag, 1G, everybody's spelling it with 2Gs. I don't know why. I think someone did it one time, and then everybody's like, oh, it must not be spelled like the you know, word, but it is. And if you want to watch a series about one of the generals, Joaquin Cosio is in a series called Gentified or Gentified on Netflix, and it's a good sitcom kind of thing. So
nice.
That's my random plug. since you mentioned one of the generals who, you know, did murder a whole bunch of birds. So, you know, I was happy when he just ignominiously died. And, you know, he's a villain. Like, the president, like, Luna is a villain. And I liked how many of them just kind of got killed like it wasn't a big thing, you know? Even though it's like, obviously, like, the U.S. sending people in to overthrow a government is horrible, and it's historical in Latin America particularly, right? I mean, I feel like this movie does make a point without really saying it's making a point. And so I think it kind of gets some ideas out there without hitting people over the head with them. But, right, you know, at the same time, it's like, you know, when it's played for laughs, maybe not so good. I don't know. I liked sort of the way that messages were kind of interwoven, and that, you know, the big villain was the system, basically. It was, you know, the U.S. government trying to maintain supremacy, essentially, you know, through the machinations of Amanda Waller. But she's just one, you know, not a cog. She's something that controls a bunch of cogs. But, you know, she's not the entirety of the system. But yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of villains. There's a lot of villains in this story.
Yeah. Just in the comics, does it have that same kind of tension of this constant, like, who's worse, the villains who make up the Suicide Squad, or Amanda Waller and the people who are like using them as a weapon?
Oh, sure. But I mean, again, like there is a really wide range of moral frameworks among the members of the squad,
Right.
and there is a really wide range of how Waller is presented as a character. Um, but yeah, I mean, it definitely plays with. There are comics that play with that idea for sure.
Makes sense.
I think the Task Force X episode on Justice League animated series is kind of particularly interesting because they frame the whole, using unpaid prison labor to carry out covert missions as it feels very different because Deadshot's about to get murdered or executed by the government. And so Amanda Waller essentially saves him because she wants to use him as a weapon, and then eventually he'll be free, right? He'll get a pardon after 5 years or whatever, or 10 years. I forget the time frame. But I think that plays very differently than it does if it's just like, yeah, you're just in jail, and we're just going to use you to run missions and put a bomb in your head. And if you don't, then we'll just kill you, or we'll threaten to kill your daughter, or whatever.
Right.
Well, I think that Bloodsport's the only one in that situation. The rest of them, they don't have to take the mission, although we don't know what leverage Waller would have used on them, but theoretically it's voluntary.
Right. Well, and for him, it's also doubly interesting because he's also the only one where, and this is kind of a thing that people often look to as a marker of a different kind of morality, and we can argue about whether that's true or not. He's the only one for whom the consequences are going to be to someone else. And great, it's not like it's not a random stranger. It's his daughter, and he obviously cares about a lot of guilt. But I think there are some people who would be like, do whatever the fuck you want to my family member. I don't care. I do think like by having Bloodsport, as they did with Deadshot, make the decision because he wants to protect someone else in his life. I thought that was a very intentional choice of being like, yeah, this person's going to be kind of our main protagonist because he, like Harley, is not as sort of morally broken as a lot of these others.
Yeah, for me, that's one of those moments where it's very clear that that's what they're doing, and they're like setting aside the point in the movie where you have to have the hero have stakes in order for the movie to continue, and it felt very perfunctory to me. Even though I enjoyed the scene with his daughter, I thought it was very funny. Like it's a great take on that scene because they're screaming at each other instead of her like crying and being like, Daddy, come home. Like it was a very funny play on it, but I also felt very much like, again, it's one of those moments where I felt like I was being told, okay, now you are supposed to have an emotion about this. Now turn your emotions off for 40 minutes while we kill people. Okay, turn them back on because I want to sell this beat too. Like, it doesn't feel like a cohesive tapestry to me. And I mean, that's how I feel about, like, that's also how I felt about Guardians of the Galaxy, which is an extremely fun and entertaining movie, but I didn't buy any of the emotional beats in it whatsoever because to me, there was not a sell-through on them.
I feel like I started this podcast thinking I wanted to defend the fact that this movie is not quite as manipulative as I knew you felt it was. I think I'm coming around to the fact that I just got more manipulated because, like, as you explained it, I think you're totally right. But like that moment where like his daughter saw him on TV and was proud, like I teared up at that. Like, and it's funny because we just had this long talk about the TV show Loki where I was ranting and screaming. I wasn't screaming, but I had to adjust the volume on my audio a little bit because I was rather impassioned about the fact that I thought Loki was trying to force emotional beats on us that I didn't buy in the slightest. And so, yeah, I think it's one of the reasons why I like analyzing these shows is I think it's I don't think all of a sudden I'm like I feel bad for having enjoyed it as much as I did. I think it was a very enjoyable movie, but I think you're right. It's interesting to kind of think about like, and I'm not totally sure I 100% agree with you, but I think it's interesting to kind of think about like, did they actually sell it, or did they just did they sell it in a way that can fit with the movie, or did they just kind of pull a fast one that once you think about it doesn't really hold up?
There were emotional beats.
Yeah, like, and on the flip side of that, like, I don't want to come across like I hated this movie. It was too cynical for me, and I didn't buy any. Like, part of what makes it work is that it's stacked with, the one exception we mentioned, with phenomenal performances.
Yeah.
So when these characters are portraying emotional moments, they do it, like, the actors are doing a really good job of it. And during the bits in between, it's super funny. Like, the scene that I keep coming back to is when that guy Milton is killed.
Yeah.
And
oh, right.
and
I'm like,
Polka
who is
Dot
Milton?
Man, yeah, and like, it's very fair that Harley doesn't know who he is because she just got there.
Yeah,
She wasn't hanging out with them.
No.
But like, Polka Dot Man is really upset, and it's a really, really funny sequence that also is based on, like, Polka Dot Man having an emotional reaction to something that we never saw any framework for. Mm-hmm. And the joke is that all of these people are interchangeable, and Harley doesn't bother to remember their names because so many of them are dying. Like, it's both a scene that works really well, and the more you think about it, the more problematic it is, both on a structural level and on an ethical level. But it's really, really funny when you're watching it.
And, like, that scene especially, I think when I was most conscious of the fact that all of this, like, we're killing innocent people, was brown people who were being killed. Because, like, I think if that was, like, I think if they were in made-up European country instead of made-up South American country, and that person was white, not that, like, I'm saying, like, yeah, all white people can be killed without moral problem, but, like, I think a white character not noticing the humanity of a person of color just hits a lot worse than it would have if it was just, like, another white person.
Yeah, and then she also thinks that Milton is Idris Elba's name at the end of the movie, and I was like, ooh, all right. Yeah. And again, it's a funny joke, but it's also like, oh, no.
But, like, at the same point, like, I feel like that's kind of the joke. Like, that's true. Does that make sense?
No, I know. I get what you're saying. My problem with that sort of thing is, and this goes back to like, especially the scene where they're killing the freedom fighters.
Yeah.
When you ask an audience to cheer on something reprehensible and also recognize that it's reprehensible at the same time, I am very skeptical that both of those things can happen in the human brain at once, and I think that a lot of people are going to miss it. There's a really, really phenomenal video by Lindsay Ellis on YouTube that talks about this a little bit, and it's about Jewish humor for non-Jewish audiences, basically, and, like, can you make Hitler jokes? Can you make Holocaust jokes? Like, who is allowed to make those, and when do they work and when do they not work? And she talks about the producers, and she also talks about things like American History X, where you're presenting, a reprehensible person, but he looks really cool doing it. Mm-hmm. And so how many people came out of that movie going, that was dope, and not, that was reprehensible.
Right.
And in this case, how many people walked away from that fight scene where Bloodsport and Peacemaker are competing to see who can kill the most brown people in the awfulest ways, and just went, that was so funny and badass,
right,
and never picked up on the underlying message that I do think is also in there. But how many people walked away from that scene going, that was so funny and so badass, and never picked up that there was another message to it, or will only remember the part that was funny and badass.
I think that's fair, and I have a comment of where I think I falls, but the first thing it reminds me of, and I talked about this a while ago on this show, but I haven't talked about it, I think, in a couple of years. One of my favorite sets of books and movies is The Hunger Games, and I really love what the book is trying to do of like make a critique of violence and a critique of like the commercialization of violence as entertainment, which I mean our enjoying this movie is exactly what Hunger Games was supposed to be critiquing, which is kind of the point as well.
But it's also no, go ahead. You make the point. Sorry.
But the director of the movie said they had this real problem because the movie is the story is all supposed to be about that violence isn't cool. And so how do you show the violence of the book on screen? And the director said that like his sort of like or maybe her, I forget, or theirs. The director said that their like benchmark was they didn't want any kids to walk out of the movie and want to reenact the fight scene. So I totally hear where you're coming from, Jessica. And I think that's to some extent a fair critique of this movie. I feel like I think with satire, there's always this question of like, are you making it clear enough that it's satire, that it's okay, or do people think you're being serious? I think you're right. Yeah. This movie doesn't do a good enough job as it should have.
Well, I think I'm glad that you said satire because that was the thing that I couldn't put my finger on. I don't think that most of the humor in this movie is not punching up. Mm-hmm. It's so much of it is punching down, and scenes like the freedom fighter scene are punching down to me.
That's fair. The point that I was going to make, though, is that I feel like when you compare it to something like the Joker movie that came out recently, or like some other things where I feel like, I'm not trying to justify it, but I sort of feel like in terms of finding that line of satire that makes clear that it's satire, I feel like this movie did, so many people, the director of, and the writer of the Joker defend it by saying like it's supposed to be about this horrible person. It's supposed to be satire. From what I see, like most of the audience didn't get that.
No.
And I feel like there have been a couple other things where that's the case. And so I guess to me, like this feels like it's so not as bad as some of the most egregious ones that I don't blame it as much. But I do think you're right. I think that it definitely, it missed that line, and the punching down part of it makes missing that line a lot worse.
I feel like it's punching everywhere. Like in that scene specifically, like you could say it's punching down, and in terms of the literal violence being enacted on screen, it is engaging in all manners of creative violence in a downward direction. But I feel like the butt of the joke is like the U.S. government, like stomping around like Bildschneip, like just trampling everywhere and like not having any regard for, collateral damage and just calling it collateral damage and not, mass murder. And I felt like that was also I think the joke is on Harley about Milton, but again, Milton is the victim of the violence. And, then like Polka Dot Man getting stomped on kind of for laughs, but like also, I don't know if that was like for stakes or what, or like I felt like when Milton got killed, like that actually was out of all the deaths probably the one besides like the bird in the very beginning that like I felt like hit the most. And I don't know. I think you make a really, really legit point in terms of when creating any kind of story, telling any kind of story, creating whatever kind of art, different people are going to interpret it differently. And I think it's 100% true that a lot of people will see this movie and not think of, the U.S. government and the CIA and the military's interventions abroad, like, will not see that as kind of the target of the shots. But I do. And so, like, for myself, I feel like I can enjoy the movie on its own as, like, kind of seeing what's going on and having my own interpretation of it. I enjoy my own interpretation of it. But I am concerned about, like, what other people's interpretations will be. Like, the Joker movie, honestly, I thought it was a really, really well-made movie that made some points that I really agree with. I also can see how a lot of people watched it and thought, like, it was making very different points that I very, very, very much do not agree with. And when it comes to, like, I don't know what types of stories to tell. I think it's tricky, and I don't think there's like an easy answer. I think questionable is kind of where it falls for me, but it feels like it works to me because I feel like I'm seeing a particular joke, and I don't think the joke is haha, a bunch of brown people are getting killed and their deaths don't matter, their lives didn't matter. I think the joke is about, the U.S. government using, exploiting prison labor and, fucking around abroad and overthrowing governments and not really caring about the consequences to people. But like, a lot of people aren't going to care about that, and they're just going to be like, haha, that's so funny the way that person got killed. And like, that's not the best.
You can't predict how every single person in the audience is going to react to your movie. You can't idiot-proof your movie, and you can't make art for what you assume will be the lowest level of comprehension, because
Zack Snyder.
Yeah, because when you do, it sucks.
Yeah. I was going to say that we get that movie about emojis coming to life.
Oh, God, yes.
But at the same time, to me, it did feel like it was kind of trying to both go, haha, people are dying, and haha, the U.S. military-industrial complex is terrible. And
right.
Yeah.
Those two things, it was trying to have its cake and eat it too, in many, many ways throughout the movie, was how I felt.
I think that's fair, because I sort of am left feeling like, is Milton a brown person in this movie because the point is supposed to be that we would send the Suicide Squad to, a Latin American nation a lot faster than we would to other parts of the world, and let's talk about how awful the U.S. government is? Or is it that audiences maybe wouldn't have been able to laugh at it quite as easily if it had been a white person instead of a brown person? Some parts of audiences, I hate the fact that that's even a thing, and I really, really hope that wasn't a part of James Gunn's consideration. But I think some studio executives certainly think in those terms. I also wonder, though, if there's a third part of this, which is that, and this is a thing that we talk about a lot on this show, they didn't make up this country for this movie. And I wonder if this is also a situation where you had a country made up at a time where our understanding of the ethical issues involved in telling a story about Americans going into a Latin American country were not as, people were pretty happy to tell those stories 30 years ago in ways that at least some of us today see them as a lot more problematic. And so I also wonder if they just kind of took that story from however many years ago without taking the time to think maybe we shouldn't be telling a story about a bunch of Americans invading a Central American country quite as happily as we did 20 years ago?
Well, I'm not sure if Corto Maltese was created for the story that I described earlier, or if it was created previously to that, but I think that the big difference in the story in the comics is that they are going in to undo the harm that has been done already by Americans invading.
Oh, that's a big change.
that is, that's their only motivation. And at the end, the Corto Maltese freedom fighter, who is the reason that they knew about this and went in, is like, well, now we don't have a president. Hey, Waller, do you want to be our president? And
Wow.
she's like, are you kidding? And it's a joke, and they kind of joke about she's like, no, that's ridiculous. And then somebody on the squad ribs her about it, and she's like, watch it, or I'll have my new firing squad shoot you. It's funny because she's pretending she's going to be president of this country. She's obviously not going to take that job because she does not have the right to. But if they wanted to use a different part of the world, they could very easily have done Vltava, which is an Eastern European fictional country that is ruled by Count Vertigo, who is also a recurring member of the Suicide Squad. They had plenty of
or
opportunities
or something.
Yeah, they have a lot of fictional countries.
And this is where I hate the meta conversations about these movies, because I imagine somewhere some studio executive said, if we put it in an Eastern European country, everyone's going to say, oh, you're just copying Sokovia.
Yeah.
Which,
Yeah, which they have, DC has Markovia. Like, they have very similar fictional countries. The other thing I think would have helped with this is if any of the Corto Maltesian characters had been developed in any way. Like, President Luna is the only one who gets anything, and all we really get is that he looks good in a Speedo. Like, there's no... You know, if the leader of the freedom fighters...
He likes
even
birds.
She had a scene where she was like, I'm doing this because I'm going to tell you why I love my country in 30 seconds. Like, that would have helped.
Yeah. Well, so I think we could just spend an entire episode just talking about this question, but I want to go on to another deeply ethically complex character who is clearly a stand-in for a lot of very intense social issues in our world today. And I'm, of course, talking about Starro. Being a little sarcastic here, what do you all think of where does Starro fall on the, like, a script writing 101 class would look at this movie and say, oh, Starro's the big bad. But I think obviously we're supposed to think that's not quite the case. And Paul, you already pointed out, like, Starro just wanted to hang out in the stars. Where does Starro fit for you in terms of this question of, like, who is a villain? And how do you feel that was either successfully or not successfully portrayed?
Starro's a MacGuffin. Starro's like the helicarrier in Winter Soldier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I feel like... yeah, I mean, Starro is basically just, like, the plot thing, which... I want to say something about the word MacGuffin, but I'm not going to.
I mean, I'm going to give you random trivia about Starro in the comics in a minute, so if you want to give trivia about MacGuffin...
Yeah, I mean, MacGuffin is supposed to be, like, the origin of the word MacGuffin is, like, something that isn't actually really particularly a thing that's, like, on screen. It's, like the ultimate example that I've seen is, I think, Mission Impossible, I want to say 3, where, like, there's some weapon on, like, a USB drive, and, like, their mission is to get it, and they get it, and then he hands it over, and they're like, don't you want to know what it does? And he's like, no. Like, that's a MacGuffin, you know, where it's like we don't even know what the thing is, we just know that it matters. Here, like, Starro is a character, you know? I mean, we don't know much about Starro, except that Starro was out in space, and then, I don't know, fell to Earth? Oh, no. They encountered him in space, right? U.S. astronauts, and then they're like, we'll plop him down on Corto Maltese, and, like, and then run a bunch of tests with, you know, Nazi scientists, and basically, you know, manipulate the government of this country, and let them use it to, like, murder dissidents. And, you know, Starro's basically just, like, trying to survive, and is really a victim, right? Like, has been held in captivity for 30 years and used for these experiments, and then gets loose and is like, rawr! So...
Yeah, I mean, you know, of all the many deaths that I did or didn't cheer for, I think Starro killing Thinker, who...
Oh, hell yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Does Thinker have, like... I just kept thinking, like, you go to a gentleman's club, what happens if someone trips and falls on your head? Like... Those
things on the head.
Yeah.
You need a helmet.
Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, no... back to the actual question of Starro. I kind of think you're both right, because if I understand what you mean by the MacGuffin, I think what you meant is that Starro is the obstacle that has to be overcome, but not necessarily like the evil thing. Is that kind of a fair way to put it?
Yeah. He's, again, like the helicarrier, Starro is sentient, but that particular plot role could have been taken by something that was not sentient, as long as it was very hard to destroy.
It could have been like a volcano that was going to explode unless they, like, cut out the... I think that's where Corto Maltese showed up in the animated series.
Yeah.
And then they sent Doomsday to go try to kill Superman there.
It's part of, you know, I'm thinking about this, and I'm just thinking, like, if we'd had more... there's so many of the stories that if we just had more development on, and I think at this point, like, the biggest effect of the pandemic is I'm just done with movies. I want everything to be like a 4 to 8 episode, show. Like, just give us more of that development. I feel
the opposite.
If you want more about these characters, let me tell you about something called comic books.
What?
There's just oodles of them.
Tell us about Starro.
So Starro is the reason that the Justice League originally formed. Their very first adventure
What?
together,
This
they
character?
team up to, yeah, the very first Justice League story, they team up to defeat Starro, who is a giant starfish that comes to Earth and to take over and like puts a little baby starfish on people's faces. Except, obviously it's a comic from the '60s, so once they defeat Starro, the little baby starfish fall off and the people are fine.
Right.
They don't all die horribly. But and like Starro just shows up every so often to be a big villain from space. But my favorite thing about Starro is that one of those little baby starfish, the Justice League kept it and they raised it in a jar for a while, and so they named it Jarro. And it loves Batman and it wants to be Robin, and so they made him a little Robin costume.
Oh my God.
Wow.
Okay, so I'm just going to say two things. One, that is absolute podcasting gold. I'm so glad we have that on our air. Two, Paul, I had promised you that we'd try to keep this episode not going long. Once you are asking to learn more about Starro and going on MacGuffin tangents, you've lost the ability to complain this episode is as long as it is.
I mean, we were already past the mark we were headed for, and we haven't even really touched on Harley yet.
Yes, you're right. Let's Harley is a good segue now. Paul, what did you think? You talked about kind of Harley having an arc. What do you see as kind of Harley's arc, and what did you like or not like about her in this movie?
This is my favorite Harley I've seen in live action so far. I feel like this is Harley being like a fully realized version of Harley. Where in the original Suicide Squad, it was largely about her relationship with Joker and, very abusive relationship with Joker. And, I mean, Joker basically makes her into a supervillain. Like, she is who she is, and then he, manipulates her, twists her, and, like, has her physically disfigure herself. And if that movie had just been the only appearance of Harley Quinn in the DCEU, and like I don't care about the DCEU as an extended universe, but I feel like we kind of got a Harley trilogy, right? Where she's the main character in Birds of Prey, even though she's not technically the main title character, but she's the only individual character with her name in the title. The marketing of that movie, very confusing. But, I think I wouldn't have loved it if that was her whole arc, right? The fact that then they did Birds of Prey and Harley, liberates herself, right? And she becomes her own woman and she makes friends and she does stuff. And to me, Birds of Prey is kind of Harley becoming who Harley's gonna be.
Right.
And then this movie, to me, feels like Harley being who Harley is going to end up as. And one of my pet peeves in superhero movies is the feeling that in every single volume they need to have this like very serious character development, and the hero has to question why they're a hero. And like, this happens in there's Batman Begins, and then in The Dark Knight there's again this questioning, although maybe less of it than in things like Spider-Man 2 or whatever. Superman 2, Superman gives up the cape, and gives up his powers. And this is more other things, more recent. But, like, there's just always this sort of reinvestigation, and I feel like we rarely get to see the hero just be the hero. And while Harley is, maybe at this point, I feel like she's more of an anti-hero, or she's an anti-villain, or Harley's just Harley.
Yeah.
And I loved seeing her bust out, like you mentioned torture somewhere, and I'm really not a fan of torture in movies, and I think torture of women is maybe extra problematic, but in general, like that's the fastest way to get me to quit something is to like have a lot of torture. I feel like Harley's a character who, like, when she's being tortured in a way like that, like, she's mentally... There's something going on. There's another Suicide Squad movie where they're all, like, doing something to their brains to try and short out their chips so they won't get their heads exploded. And she's, like, just laughing. She's like, this is fun, guys, And it feels to me like, for her, it's a different experience than it is for most characters that it would be. And the fact that then she broke out on her own The fact that she shot the president when she's like, oh, that's totally a red flag. I'm going to shoot you now. And, you know, the fact that she was like, you're hot, you know, and then she's like, you know, I'm going to have sex with the president because I feel like it. And then she's like, I'm going to shoot the president because I feel like it. And it seems like the best thing to me to do at the moment. It just felt to me like Harley being Harley. And I don't know, it felt empowering in a way that wasn't like, this is empowering, but was just like, it just was. And like, as much as I love the Wonder Woman movie in the way that it delivers on that, I feel like Harley Quinn as a character delivers that in a very different way. And I feel like this movie was kind of the completion of that journey through, almost by not having there be a big journey within the movie, but just like, this is who she is. And I don't know. Then she got, you know, the kill shot in at the end too. And
I think I mostly agree with you. I know, Jessica, I think you have a different perspective, and I really want to hear that, and you may well convince me otherwise. I just want to say one quick word about her shooting the president, because I do really agree with you about that arc, and I feel like that scene was so intentional, because so much of her story up till now had been about like her falling for the wrong people, and not just guys. I mean, she's canonically queer in the first movie, which is awesome. Though I wish that was kind of, it felt like they kind of made her more straight again, this one, which is a little annoying, but whatever. But like, you know, and in the second movie, it sort of felt like she was like, okay, I need to stay away from romance. I need to not think about that. I need to like work on myself, which is super good and empowering, and like awesome that they didn't give her some stupid love story. But I love that in this, like you said, like she was able to be like, yeah, you're hot. Let's go. Let's have fun. But the moment she saw a red flag, like, no, you know, before it was I get blinded by the great sex and the great partner or whatever and think that, you know, ignore all the red flags. Now it's like, oh, you're amazing, you're wonderful. Red flag, I'm going to kill you. Right. Which is like a little more extreme than I think self-help would generally recommend.
Sure. It's not
but
the
still, that idea of being able to be like, I see a red flag, everything else goes out the window. Like that, I just thought, I love that so much.
Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed Harley in this movie. I'm not, you know, I don't have any complaints. I think that a big part of like why it's sort of, you know, we don't get any angsting, we don't get any back and forth, we don't really get an arc for her. Like, she doesn't have an arc. She does things, but she doesn't have an internal arc. And I think a huge part of that is just because it's an ensemble movie and she's not the main character in that ensemble, which is totally fine. Like, this is blood sports movie, and she is not one of the characters who is there to, I mean, you know, Polka Dot Man also doesn't have an arc, which is fine. Like, not everybody in a movie with this many characters is going to have that. I do, like, to a certain extent, I feel like you can kind of take her out of this movie and have the actual tasks that are accomplished by her sort of accomplished by anybody. Like, it's not a movie that is driven particularly by Harley's personality and her choices. But again, it's an ensemble movie, so it doesn't need to be. I think Margot Robbie is wonderful in the role. I think she did a fantastic job again. For me, I preferred the Birds of Prey take on her just because I do think it spends more time with her, because that's her movie, and it's much more about her interiority, and it does show more of a, you know, she's more compassionate in that movie, which for me personally, because I'm a Pollyanna, I like that. But she's a hell of a lot of fun in this one. I did really appreciate, because, like, you know, so many people have pointed out that the first movie, the way that she's shot is so male gazy and so exploitative, and she is in that movie to be a sex object. And
her fishnets and tight shorts are as much a character as she is in that movie.
Right. Let's have all these close-ups of her, you know, changing clothing and stuff. And Birds of Prey very, very deliberately was not about that. And I think that this movie is really good about not filming any women that way. Like, nobody in this movie is a sex pot. When Harley gets glammed up, she's glammed up like it's prom. Like, it's not she looks great, she looks beautiful, but it's not an outfit that's intended to be sexy. It's
Yeah.
an outfit that's intended to make her look like a queen.
And even when she has an incredible sex scene, like the outfit never comes. Like I was kind of like, oh god, is this when you're gonna like show us her ass? By like, nope, the outfit stayed on throughout the whole scene, which I also loved.
Yeah, and when she rips off part of her skirt because she needs the fabric, it's not like, oh, now we can see so much of her like thighs and ass because there's so much skirt. You really like it's shorter, but it's not scandalously revealing in any way. But it's also like the way that the camera is placed. Like it treats men and women the same.
Except for El
Which
Presidente, I think.
right, yeah, the only one who gets like the sex pot scenes are President Luna, which is fine by me. But the one thing that I did, and it's not even necessarily a complaint, but I did notice this. There's a scene in Birds of Prey where Harley is being tortured, and we don't see her being tortured.
Yeah.
It's the Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend scene. Like she goes into a little fantasy scene in her head, and we see a dance number instead of the torture. And I really appreciated that Birds of Prey as a film was making the conscious choice not to make the audience watch yet another scene of a woman being tortured. And so watching this movie, I was very conscious, okay, here is a scene with torture, but I think it's really notable that it's like the only scene that isn't gory in the whole movie. They chose a method that is...
Yeah, they didn't cut her. They it was a didn't do visible damage to her body in any way.
Right, like a quote unquote bloodless method. Like it would be doing way more damage to her than what we're actually shown.
Yeah.
But it's sanitized, not sanitized. Yeah, it's sanitized in a way that none of the other violence in the movie is, and I think again that was a very conscious choice not to immerse us in violence against a tied-up woman. And I think that the fact that she's singing can also imply a through line through Birds of Prey that she is once again getting through it by going into a musical number in her head.
Yeah.
And even when she is being tortured, it's not sexualized in any way. So while I also prefer not to have scenes where women are tortured, I thought that I appreciated the care with which it was handled.
Yeah, I think that's such a good way of putting it. I feel like Birds of Prey sort of set the gold standard for that kind of thing. And I didn't know why they showed her being tortured. I wonder if it's kind of like, oh, well, we can still be a little bit... Because it was so clearly a reference to Birds of Prey when she was singing her way through it. And then I did think using the song she was singing as the soundtrack for when she gets to utterly kick ass was such a brilliant callback to that. It was kind of like what I was saying about some other stuff. It was like, you got an 8 out of 10, and I wish you'd gotten a 10, but so many other things get a 3 that I still think this was so much better. Especially with how because when the sex scene, also, you're right, the ripped dress, I definitely was feeling that. And I also, and Paul, you commented on this, so if you want to comment on it more, I thought having her be the one to rescue herself as everyone else is getting ready to rescue her was such an empowering and like... Paul, I don't want to steal your line. You literally said, like, flipping the trope. Why don't you say more about that? Because I don't want to just take your line. But I thought what you pointed out was so true.
Yeah, I mean, I think basically just they're trying to subvert that trope of the, damsel in distress. And, like, the way that, like, the whole thing, I think, Jessica, you make excellent points about how that isn't, the violence there towards her is not portrayed the same way most of the violence is throughout the rest of the movie. And to me, then there's like a sort of catharsis of her busting herself out, and when they like turn the blood to like flowers or whatever, it's like I feel like they're kind of trying to like show us the way that she sees the world, and so yeah, like kind of taking something that we've seen 100 times and being like, okay, we're going to do it a little differently. It'd be like at the end of Age of Ultron, like Black Widow rescues herself and Hulk gets her. He's like, ah, and she's like, oh, hey, what's up? And he's like, well, it's, to me, it's a little bit like in Star Wars where like, they go to rescue Leia, and then, like, they really need her help to get them out of there. Like, it's a kind of incompetent rescue. Here, it's like they might have had a really great... it was a really great plan. She's like, well, I could go back in if you want, And, like, that just felt like the most Harley thing, And yeah, I just enjoyed that they took something that felt like it was going in a particular way, and they're like, no, we're going to do it a little, kind of the opposite. And it's like, she's happy to have friends there, but, like, she doesn't need them to rescue her. Like, she can rescue herself. Even though somebody who's tied up and captured by dozens of people, like, usually whoever they are probably would need someone, but, like, they don't. It's a comic book movie. You're allowed to bust yourself out. So it's like her being able to bust herself out there. I just enjoyed how they, went in one direction, and then they're like, no, we're gonna do it a little differently this time.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, and especially the flowers thing. I think is kind of an interesting comment on the whole discussion we had about, like, we haven't really talked about the gore. I feel like we were all kind of like, though to me, and again, because the movie's not as serious, I found the gore in this much less objectionable than I do in, like, The Boys.
Yeah, me too.
But here I think, like, I feel like Harley maybe falls into yet another moral category where she's very intelligent, and I don't mean this in any kind of a bad way, but she's very much a child at heart. And I feel like she has kind of a childlike idea of, like, there's not really consequences to the things she's doing. And to me, the fact that, like, the movie that was being so gratuitous about gore shows, like you said, that in her world, it's flowers that are popping out because she sees beauty in blood. She thinks he's beautiful when he's dead and bleeding out. Like, I thought that was, and again, maybe I'm giving too much credit to the writing, I thought that was a nice way of kind of underscoring, like, Harley has yet a completely different understanding of the consequences of her actions that put her again in, like, villain, hero, and doesn't really fit into a box.
Yeah, for me, I mean, the flowers are it's very Birds of Prey.
Yeah.
It is very much, yeah, and I did feel, I liked the effect, I liked the scene. I did think that the sort of aesthetic of this movie didn't really commit like, there were almost sort of chapter headings, like where you'd see, like, the name of the next section on the beach spelled out in debris or whatever, but it seemed very sparse when that would happen, whereas something like Birds of Prey or, like, Scott Pilgrim is another comic book movie that, like, picks an aesthetic and commits to it very hard the whole way through. I think that works better, whereas every time it happened in this movie, I was like, wait, what?
It didn't feel jarring, I think.
Yeah, it's very jarring, and not Jarro, which I would have liked. So for me, even though I think that it was a well-done scene, I was sort of like, why is this happening?
That's fair. So, we're already at 90 minutes, and I don't want us to go too long, way too late. But let's kind of get into the last kind of set of issues. In terms of the kind of the meta issues about this. We kind of joked already a bit about the first one being kind of, why does James Gunn hate birds so much? But Paul, I know you had a couple other kind of meta issues you wanted to bring up. So go. Well, you want to start with the birdophobia? I forget the exact word. Or another one. Go for it.
Ornithophobia, I think.
There you go.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have that much to say about it, but, like, just don't kill this many birds in your movie. Like, what the fuck, dude? Like, I don't know. That's all I got.
Like, the brothers and sisters of the first bird got revenge. Like, I did like that Savant got, like, picked to death.
Got eaten by birds.
Yeah,
I guess. I kind of liked that Weasel wasn't dead. Like, I was kind of bummed out in the beginning. I'm like, oh, you're just gonna kill the Weasel dude? Like, I mean, I know he ate a bunch of children, but, like, whatever. I don't know. I mean, yeah, I don't know. It was just very weird in terms of, like, animal characters and the treatment of animals, because, like, you had all these birds just getting murdered for no apparent reason, and then you had rats being the heroes who literally saved the world or took down Starro, but then you had Starro, who's this non-human creature who, like, I don't know, like, is a victim for most of the movie, but then is the primary, we can call him a MacGuffin if we want, and, like, then there's like King Shark and Weasel, and it's like, I don't know, man. Like, at the end of the day, I enjoyed the movie, even though it had a lot of things that I'm like, are like borderline deal breakers, which, you know, the gore is too. And it's like having a movie this gory only because it did just kind of like feel like it doesn't count. But at the same time, kind of why I liked it was because of like the weight of the interactions between, you know, Idris Elba and Viola Davis. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm just glad Sebastian made it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, I would rage quit. That would have been it.
Remotes would have been thrown. Yeah, I am with you there on Sebastian. Ant-Man is one of my absolute favorite movies, but spoiler alert, when Anthony dies, I was very upset. I was like,
yes,
don't do that. Like,
yeah.
Especially because I think like, to me, the only moral issue of like the Ant-Man or the Ratcatcher person is they're putting these animals in mortal danger, you know.
Right.
And I am sure that Starro killed many of the rats before they took Starro down. I was very glad we never saw that, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's why she was crying.
Yeah, that's also true.
Yeah.
That yeah, I think that mattered too, you know. And it was over the top and ridiculous, but that whole thing about like if rats can matter, we all can matter. Like that hit me hard. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah, Taika
Waititi just showing up for one scene in front of a green screen and getting $2 million.
What did you think, Jess, of Weasel? Because Paul, I had kind of a mixed reaction. My first reaction was like the idea that no one checked if he could swim. I thought was just brilliant. Like it was such a beautiful story note. But I was also like, this character seems so cool. I'm kind of bummed you killed him off. So I was happy he lived. But what can you tell us of Weasel? Does he have a Starro level of story cred?
I have to confess, I have never read a comic with Weasel in it. I'm sorry. I've read several comics with Marvel's Weasel, who is just a guy, but that's a different character. And I think he's in the Deadpool movies. I can bring no comics trivia about Weasel to the table. When they made that joke, like, oh, he killed 27 children, and then he immediately died. Like, I thought the drowning scene was very funny. And then when they were like, oh, he's alive, I was like, it's a funny gag, but I wasn't upset that he was alive because I don't care. But I also wasn't like, thank God the child killer is okay. It's just like, all right, that's pretty funny. The movie is over now.
Yeah.
Played by Sean Gunn, who I think is James Gunn's brother. So.
Yeah. Yeah, he's isn't he also in the Guardians of the Galaxy movies?
Yeah, I think like half the cast was in the Guardians of the Galaxy movies.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
He plays Kraglin. I don't remember who Kraglin is, but
yeah,
one of the pirate guys.
I definitely think that.
Yeah. What? Oh, I can recognize him now.
I definitely think to some extent James Gunn was very smart in recognizing how much like mixed feeling there is about the DCEU right now, in that he kind of told the movie that like it could fit in the canon, it could not, no one cares, you know. And and to go back, I would say like one of the things that I thought this movie did so well, this is getting more into like review than ethics, but I think like, you know, the ethics of good movie making. I think that this movie did something that Marvel has never quite managed to do, which is to take a person who's had, well, with the Avengers they have, but it can be a problem later on. Like, once a character has really had their own sort of like big movie, it can be, I think it's often very hard to put them back into an ensemble with characters who haven't had their own movies yet. And I did think, like, I think you're right. If you wanted a Harley movie, I can understand why this wouldn't be the movie for you. But I was actually really impressed that they were able to be, and that Margot Robbie apparently is perfectly fine also with Harley gets her movie, and then now Harley gets to be part of a team again, and she's not shunted to the side, but she's just part of the gang, and does, you know, and it is more Idris Elba's story than anyone else.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to go on my Birds of Prey rant, which is I really enjoyed the movie. I think it's a very good movie. I think it's definitely vastly underrated, particularly amongst DCEU canon. But, like, calling it a Birds of Prey movie when it's a Harley Quinn movie, just call the damn thing a Harley Quinn movie, maybe have it be an origin story for the Birds of Prey, and then give the Birds of Prey their own movie. Like, what are you doing? It drives me mad. Anyway, go ahead.
I feel like it would have sold better if it was just called Harley Quinn too, because that's
100%.
just way more name recognition. Like nobody's going Birds of Prey, like that WB show from 2001.
Exactly. Like, I was excited to see a Birds of Prey movie, and I'm like, what do you mean it's going to be a Harley Quinn movie? Like, if you want to sell me on a Harley Quinn movie, give me a Harley Quinn movie and call it that. Like, and she's got so much more name recognition. Like, it could have made twice as much in the box office.
It was a very weird choice. I do think that it's my understanding that basically the what they're saying at the top at Warner Brothers now is they're not worrying about a cohesive canon. They're not trying to make an MCU.
They
because
were before.
Right.
Sorry.
They failed, but they were attempting to emulate the MCU. They did a terrible job, and now it's very much more like you're going to go over here and do whatever you want plot-wise and tonally. Like, I'm sure, like, they can have a throwaway line that Superman was shot with a kryptonite bullet, but we assume that he's fine. They cannot have Superman fly in and defeat Starro at the end.
Yeah.
But yeah, like to have something like Birds of Prey, which has a very distinct tone and does play in the Gotham space and makes Batman jokes without, actually having the character in there. And that is not meant to, like, we're not meant to go into the upcoming The Batman with the understanding that Harley Quinn definitely knows Bruce Wayne's secret.
Yeah.
Or like you can have Shazam over in its corner with its very specific tone and this incredibly powerful character, and we don't have to, again, sit here watching Starro storm around this island and wonder, well, why isn't Shazam coming to stop him?
Yeah. I will just say, as a little bit of a pushback from the from the filthy casual perspective, I thought the title of the movie was perfect because for me, I don't know anything about the Birds of Prey going in. And so I thought it actually was a very good way of introducing the Birds of Prey. And it felt to me like a Birds of Prey movie that was primarily about Harley, but in which all the other characters also got a strong introduction. And we saw how they came together and the way that Harley both played an essential role in that, but then also kind of stepped back because she wasn't going to be a part of all them going forward. So I think knowing the stuff that you all know, I'm probably completely wrong, but that's just kind of like a different perspective.
No, I think it's definitely an ensemble movie. I just think that if you put a character people know the name of in the title, more people will see it. That's all.
That's also probably true.
Yeah.
Probably true.
Yeah, I also thought they did Huntress kind of dirty, but like she's my favorite character out of those characters, aside from Harley. And I was just like, really? This is Huntress? I don't know.
Yeah, and there again, the dirty casual part helps me in that the only Huntress I can remember is from the Arrowverse, and this is much better. So
Amy Acker,
is so much better.
Amy Acker with like the Question in the animated series. Oh, she was so good in that.
I saw the animated series at not the time in my life when I had the highest mental acuity. So
fair,
I remember
very fair.
A lot of ideas of it, not the exact details.
Fair.
That doesn't mean I was drunk all the time. It's mental illness.
Yeah, we got you.
So we're coming up on 2 hours, which, as I said, you put three New Yorkers on a microphone together. We are the three most verbose people, with the possible exception of Jacob Alichich, who's also from the state of New York. So East Coast, New York again proven. We're all going to be pretty verbose. I knew this was going to go on for a while, but do we have any kind of last thoughts to wrap this up?
I have one closing thought. I was going to talk about like Gunn wanting to make a movie that was basically like fuck Marvel because they fired him in like 2018 because reasons that then they're like, all right, maybe our reasons weren't that good. Maybe you're not Harvey Weinstein. We'll hire you back and you can do Guardians of the Galaxy 3. But like, I don't know. There's not that much to say there. More, I think like the simultaneous release, like I'm very supportive of simultaneous online and in theater release. I mean, whether you should even have movies in theaters right now, I don't know. That depends on where you are probably. But like, I think not having them released online at the same time is actually pretty gross. I'm pretty bummed that Shang-Chi isn't going to be online when it's going to come out. I do think that my understanding is that Warner Brothers actually like contacted and like renegotiated contracts with a lot of people who had points on the films, and I think that's absolutely the right way to go. And even though I think the Scarlett Johansson's lawsuit against Disney probably isn't like super solid on a legal basis, I do think that by not proactively being like, look, hey, we're going to do this thing because what we think is a good reason, and we want to try and, reach out and make things more equitable, right? Like, everybody's making less money right now for the most part, except for a very small number of people, and things were always going to go more this direction. I think they've gone this direction faster than they would have because of the pandemic, but I think like Disney really, I would say dropped the ball, but that's not accurate. Like, they deliberately decided to just go like pure legal route.
They took the ball.
They took the ball, exactly.
They kept it.
Exactly. And I think like from a legal standpoint, that's probably within their legal rights from my understanding of the contracts. But like, it's a bad look. Just like try to do right by the people that you're engaged in business with for a decade. Like, just, step up and be like, okay, we're not going to give you full points on streaming profits, but like, we're going to try and work something out. And if you can't work something out, you can't work something out. But at least like try, and it feels like they didn't do that. And I feel like in that case, kind of everyone's to some extent in the wrong. Here, I feel like I don't know the details of everything with Warner Brothers, but my understanding is that they did actually provide additional compensation to people who had points on films that did not get a exclusive theatrical release.
Yeah, I mean, I think Disney was definitely trying to set a precedent of we get to keep all the money and none for you. And I appreciate that Warner Brothers is apparently not, signing on wholeheartedly to do that, because certainly if all of the studios agreed that that's how they were going to conduct business, there would be very little that anybody could do. And like, whether or not Scarlett Johansson wins her lawsuit, she is shining a light on something that is much more widespread than just her.
It's a situation that I have such mixed feelings. Well, I think I've pretty solidly come down on the same side. We're all coming down on, but like, I'm not a great fan of Scarlett Johansson to begin with. I don't start from a perspective of, given all of her stuff about like, what actors can play what roles. I generally don't have a feeling of like, you only got paid $20 million, you deserved 50. That's not to me the social justice issue I want to write a folk song about. And Paul, as you said, also like,
I want to write that song.
and Paul, as you said, like, I think like, to me, if they get locked in a contract so much that they have to say the only way you can go see these movies that you've been wanting to see for years is to risk, continuing the infection of a plague that should have died out months ago if our country wasn't so stupid. Like, all of those reasons, you'd think I'd be on the side of Disney, but it's just basic, like, respect for your talent, like, you made a deal with the circumstances have changed, and so you can say like, look, the contract doesn't necessarily apply in the same way before, but then let's renegotiate it. Not like, we've made a fundamental,
which she was willing to do.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just
I don't.
Disney had to work very hard to get me on Scarlett Johansson's side in a lawsuit, but they didn't. They met that bar.
Yeah, I'm with you that I have very much soured on her because of some of her casting choices and the things that she has said about them. But I still believe she should get paid what she was told she would be paid.
Yeah.
Like, that doesn't change. Like, she is, even if it is a ridiculous amount of money, it is nowhere near as ridiculous as what Disney is pulling in.
Yeah.
And so she is not the big fish here. She is the medium fish, and they should honor their contracts.
I do think that like, they are not necessarily not honoring their contracts insofar as like, she took points, which everybody takes points, and to take points is to take on a level of risk. And so I do think like, it's not like there's going to be $0 between 20 million and 50 million. Like, I just think on the legal issue, like, Disney's not really in the wrong. Like, I don't think like, I don't think she's right from a legal standpoint, as far as I can tell. But I think that the way that they're operating is gross, basically, if that makes sense.
I don't think this is a legal podcast, and I don't want the legal part of it to be what takes us over the 2-hour mark.
It's not a Daredevil episode.
Exactly. Matt Murdock should represent her in court. Yeah. But
yes.
But
Charlie Cox would do it.
Yeah, you go. That would probably go very badly for Scarlett Johansson. My only counterpoint to that, Paul, is my understanding is that part of her points contract was based on language that said, as it always does, that the movie would be released exclusively to theaters before it was released in other formats.
Right, and that's the way that it's been being portrayed, but the word exclusively, I'm pretty sure, is not actually in the contract from what I've seen. It's implied in people's minds that it's supposed to be a widespread theatrical release, but the word exclusively is not in there.
Right, and so it gets into all these legal questions about, like, when unforeseen events happen, to what extent does the contract written under circumstances where that would have been the case, how much does it or does it not apply? And that's a whole area of legal thought I have no idea of. We're not legal experts, but at least one of our cases, Jessica, you've demonstrated that you're a comic book expert. And for people who want to read more about your, I'll tell you where to find more about my bad segues later. But for people who want to hear more about your thoughts on comic books as well as so much other stuff, tell us about where folks can find your writing. Actually, now that you are not only a commentator, but a creator yourself.
That was beautiful. That was absolutely seamless. Yes, I do a lot of writing about comics and books in general at bookriot.com. I just had a piece about Harley's very first appearances in both Batman the Animated Series and the comics go up, if you want to check that out. And I had my first fiction published in Sword Stone Table, which is an anthology of Arthurian legend retellings and stories that play with the mythology, but it is a diverse, gender-bent, race-bent, LGBTQ, etc. Take on, or many takes on the mythology, and that just came out last month, and you can find that wherever books are sold.
Yeah, it is. I've read a number of the stories. I think they're very good, but Jessica, I especially loved yours. I don't want to spoil it or give anything away, so I really can't say anything about what it's about. But it's just such a brilliant take on a story that folks have heard before that I really appreciated. And I'll also say, because we're now a big official podcast, that there are many ways you can buy that book, but there's a particular link we're going to give you in the show notes for this podcast that will take you to, it's basically like a website that allows you to buy from a local bookstore just through a conglomeration. So it's not Amazon or anything like that. But if you buy from there, not only will you support Jessica and we support all the other great authors and support a local bookstore, it's also an affiliate link. So a little bit of that money will also come to help support this podcast and the rest of the podcasts of the Stranded Panda Network. So I'm going to happily ride Jessica's coattails to get a couple more cents while trying to encourage more people to buy that book. And speaking of the other person whose Twitch coattails I've been riding, Paul, what are you up to these days?
Oh, I'm making many cents on twitch.tv as Zen Madman, and you can find me on Twitter as Zen Madman. And I was gonna plug my writing, but I never put it anywhere. So, but I was gonna mention writing about serial killers. I don't know, as heroes. Somehow that fit into this theme, I thought. But
I understand that.
Well, yeah. Those places, stuff. I don't know, whatever.
Well, and of course, you can find everything about this podcast and all my podcasts by going to theethicalpanda.com. You can find us on Facebook or on Twitter at The Ethical Panda. And you can email us at theethicalpanda@gmail.com. And I'm saying all that because more than anything, this is a conversation. I love this podcast because I get to say, hey, I watched this movie. Let me get two of my smartest friends on and discuss it with them. Because I want to hear other people's thoughts. I don't want to just talk to myself. My partners might disagree, but for real, I want to hear other people's thoughts too. So, what do you all think? What did you think of the movie? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Is this not the version you wanted to see? Do you think it's brilliant? How does this? I'd love to hear from people who love both Suicide Squad movies. Whatever your perspective, write into us, as I said, theethicalpanda@gmail.com, or you can find us on Facebook or Twitter at The Ethical Panda. And of course, this podcast, my Star Wars Universe podcast, and a whole bunch of other great podcasts all can be found on the Stranded Panda Podcast Network. The flagship of that podcast network is the MCU Cast, the Marvel Cinematic Universe podcast. They've done great coverage of this. Bingers Assemble. I'm sorry, no. The Marvel podcast very much did not. But the host of that, Matt Carroll, did do coverage of all of the Harley Quinn movies, including this one, on the Bingers Assemble podcast, which is a part of the Stranded Panda Podcast Network. So definitely check all those out. Please buy the book if you haven't done so. Please check out all of our other podcasts. And the most important thing, the thing that I think is just so essential that I must ask you to do, is have a good day. Insert witty comment from Paul here.